Imagine your city stolen, your time reset, and your family starved by an occupying army. This is the harrowing true story of life and resistance in occupied France. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a new story. It is late on the night of August 18th, 1944. Paris, the city of light, is illuminated now only by moonlight. In the distance, the rumble of artillery, the Allies closing in, provides the night's soundtrack, and it grows louder with each day. Curfew is, of course, in effect. German patrols march the empty streets, the thud of their heavy boots echoing through the dark alleyways. But despite the obvious danger, a small French family is scurrying through the shadows. The woman clutches her newborn child. Her husband and young son are carrying home new blackout curtains, a small, desperate attempt at normalcy in a world gone mad. Every shadow could hide a patrol. One wrong turn, one loud noise, could mean disaster. Yet, the father remains outwardly calm, navigating the winding back streets with a familiar, reassuring ease. But just as they round the last corner, clack! The son stumbles over a loose cobblestone. The family freezes. Utter terror. They know they have only seconds. The mother hauls her son to his feet, and the three of them bolt, vanishing deeper into the maze-like streets of the occupied city. Following the French surrender on June 22, 1940, the country was unceremoniously split in two. In the north, you had the German-occupied zone. In the south, a brand-new puppet regime under French Marshal Philippe Pétain. This Vichy France was created because, frankly, the Germans lacked both the time and the manpower to govern all of France themselves. Oh, and the Italians, who had assisted Hitler's conquest, mostly by jumping in at the last possible second, were also granted a small occupied zone of their own. Call it a participation award. From the onset of the occupation, a great shadow fell across the people of France. And I mean that quite literally. The Germans immediately brought French clocks forward by 1 hour to align with Berlin time. This petty power move prolonged the morning darkness and hastened the arrival of night. This was just the first of a host of new rules. Soon enough, it was illegal to possess firearms, aid escaped prisoners of war, or listen to foreign propaganda. Basically, any radio station not blessed by the German government, like the BBC. But perhaps most impactful was the vague, all-encompassing clause against showing hostility to the occupiers. This essentially gave them free rein to interpret anything as hostile and do whatever they wanted. Paris was rapidly swarmed by thousands of German soldiers on leave, eager to enjoy the sights. Many of its famous hotels were quickly commandeered, repurposed as headquarters for various Nazi military and political organizations. The tourists had become the management. On top of dealing with young, eager Wehrmacht recruits flooding the capital, the armistice had fixed the exchange rate between the franc and the Reichsmark at 20-1. This was legalized theft. It made even the lowliest German private obscenely wealthy, able to stock up on as much cheese and wine as he could smuggle past his commanding officers. Not that the officers were any better. Far from setting a good example, the ranking members of the German army set about requisitioning vast amounts of supplies from the helpless French people. Baggage trains were soon leaving France daily, laden with luxury items, exotic foodstuffs, and priceless works of art. But as much as the French people resented this inglorious plundering, far worse was in store. Nazi officials imposed a nationwide curfew, prohibiting all activity between midnight and 6 a.m. This curfew became a favorite tool, a baton used to beat the populace into submission, pushed earlier and earlier in response to any act of civil disobedience. But while this treatment was humiliating, the real changes were just beginning. As the war dragged on and the Nazi supply situation, surprise, deteriorated. Greater and greater material pressure was exerted on its occupied territories. The flow of luxury goods out of France was soon replaced by an even greater flow of essentials. Wax, metal, textiles, leather. Anything not nailed down was shipped to Germany. This, naturally, led to the issuing of yet another dreaded piece of paperwork, the ration card. Rationing in France started strict and only got stricter. By 1941, daily caloric intake for an adult had fallen sharply from 2,400 calories to between 1,200 and 1,500. Just enough to survive. By comparison, German citizens in 1941 were still consuming a relatively healthy 2,000 calories a day. With harsh rationing came the inevitable rise of the black market. Here, enterprising, or desperate, Frenchmen sold hoarded goods to their countrymen at exorbitant prices. Farmers caught doing this faced stiff fines or imprisonment. But that was little deterrent when your goods could fetch 30 times the official price. This led to the creation of informal barter systems between city dwellers and rural villages, a desperate network just to get by. Thanks to arrangements like these, the French people endured. But endured is the operative word. Many citizens were now refugees, displaced by the invasion and the new dividing line. With nearly 2 million French soldiers held captive in Germany, entire communities became ghost towns. Even Paris was affected, its pre-war population of nearly 3 million falling drastically by the time of the occupation. Families remained separated by a particularly vindictive clause in the armistice. Germany was under no obligation to release any of the prisoners of war. These men weren't just prisoners, they were hostages. And the French people were now expected to work for their release. As more able-bodied German men were drafted to the Eastern Front, the Axis's need for foreign labor exploded. Ludicrously upbeat propaganda posters depicting happy French laborers whistling while they worked had existed from the start, but, shockingly, they drew little interest. Drastic measures were needed. In March 1942, Hitler appointed Fritz Sauckel as the general plenipotentiary for labor deployment. His job was to secure foreign labor by any means necessary, a role that earned him the chillingly accurate nickname, the Slaver of Europe. Sauckel's first initiative, cooked up with the Vichy government, was called the Relève, or relief. The concept was simple. For every 3 French workers who volunteered to go to Germany, 1 French prisoner would be released. This allowed Vichy officials to crow about the great compromise they'd achieved. It also fueled a new propaganda strategy. Working in Germany was now an act of utmost patriotism, a selfless sacrifice to help reunite brave soldiers with their families. But even this emotional blackmail only brought in around 250,000 volunteers by the end of 1942, far below quota. So, in February 1943, Sauckel pressured Vichy into endorsing the Service du Travail Obligatoire, or STO, compulsory work service. This required all healthy males aged 18 to 50 and all single females aged 21 to 35 to be subject to any work the government deemed necessary. No matter how the Vichy government tried to spin this new scheme, there was no hiding its true nature. It was a slave labor program, pure and simple. The introduction of the STO was the breaking point. The French people had stoically endured starvation, displacement, and daily injustice. But this was too much. The French resistance, which up until this point had been, shall we say, more of an irritant to the Nazis, suddenly saw its membership explode. Thanks primarily to the efforts of Fritz Sauckel, many men and women fled to the countryside to escape the labor draft, becoming the Maquis. The name came from a Corsican word for the type of rough, scrubby highland terrain that dominated much of rural France. This land was ideal cover for resistance activities, but it quickly became a bloody battleground. Rural French communities found themselves embroiled in a desperate struggle where there was no such thing as an innocent bystander. As early as 1940, German policy towards partisan activity was one of savage collective punishment. If a resistance member was identified, his or her family was often summarily executed. As the occupation progressed, this policy widened into one of indiscriminate retaliation, especially in rural areas. By 1944, France was littered with mass graves and deserted villages whose inhabitants had been massacred by the SS or the Gestapo. But perhaps even more insidious than the Gestapo was the milice. This was a paramilitary force of French collaborators who worked closely with the occupiers and the Vichy government to keep their fellow countrymen under control. Some members were pre-war fascists from far-right parties, but many others were just opportunists, drawn in by the promise of better rations and, crucially, exemption from the STO. Milice interrogators regularly engaged in brutal torture to extract intel from suspected resistance fighters, and the information they obtained led directly to many of the worst massacres of the occupation. In the years to come, however, they would realize their collaboration would not go unpunished. In June 1944, the German stranglehold was finally broken by the Normandy landings. The resistance played a significant role, isolating German forces in the region. A month later, Operation Dragoon began in the south, forcing a German withdrawal from the remaining occupied territories. In Paris, despite possessing fewer than 100 guns at the start of the uprising, the resistance quickly armed itself with captured German weapons, including tanks. As chaos engulfed the nation, angry mobs took to the streets. When news of their struggle reached the Allies, a Free French armored division rushed to the capital. The Nazi governor, seeing the writing on the wall, promptly surrendered. Liberation, however, was a bloody affair. Estimates on the number of collaborators killed by vigilante mobs vary widely, but it was likely around 10,000 individuals. This was followed by official trials known as the épuration légale, or legal purge. In a grim irony of history, many of those who escaped vigilante justice found themselves interned in the very concentration camps originally built by the Vichy government to hold its enemies. France had also lost most of its infrastructure thanks to the Allied bombing campaigns that preceded liberation. In total, some 150,000 civilians had died during the occupation. Of that number, a staggering 30,000 had been directly executed by Germans for various crimes, and another 60,000 had fought and died with the resistance. Throughout the brutality and hardships, the spirit of the French people remained unbroken. While a few, like the milice, sought to escape hardship by ingratiating themselves with their new masters, the vast majority were united in opposition to Nazi rule. Within a few decades, France would once again be one of the leading nations in Europe, with a strong economy and a founding position in NATO. But one only needs to walk through the ruins of martyred villages like Oradour-sur-Glane, left exactly as the SS departed, to see the dreadful, agonizing price France paid for its freedom.